Here is Sailor Maryland, a brown ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook. This is a lighter sepia brown than I had expected. I do have to say that I think in general they put a good amount of effort into the decisions on this ink. There is a little tone variation by nib, though there is some. It does shade fairly well across a broad range of nibs and papers. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it performs generally as well as it does on the good stuff. A real bonus in value. The sepia inks are among my favorites in the browns. If I lived in Maryland, I would probably have purchased 2 bottles of this. It's a fantastic sepia brown. All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib that writes rather dry, a Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet, a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow, a Lamy All-Star with a broad nib that writes average. The pen for today is a Sailor 1911. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the soft fine nib, we get a nice lighter tone of brown with no feathering, no spread, some nice shading going on, such as what you see with such on the first line, where the S is darker than the UC and the H gets quite a bit darker in the N. It should shade fairly regularly, looking at should on the second line, where the S is light, the H gets quite a bit darker, the OU lighten up a little bit, the LD at the end quite a bit darker. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade very well. It changes tone during the writing as well, where you see it starts out darker than it ends up. I think it's a matter of just where the ink gets to sit in the pen for a little while, a day or two before it gets used. But looking at a majority of the writing, it's got some great shading. Look at luckily on the second line, where the L is darker than the UC. The K gets quite a bit darker. The I lightens up a little bit, dark at the L, light at the top of the Y, dark at the top or the bottom of the Y. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine. Same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade very well, not beyond what you would expect with many brown inks. Looking at beyond on the first line, where the B is dark, the E and beginning of the Y are light. The downstroke of that Y into the O, very dark, light, and light beginning of the D, but the up and downstroke of that D are quite a bit darker. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium. It does not feather and it does not spread. I would venture to say it shades very well. Looking at venture on the first line, where the V is quite a bit darker than the E. The N during the N transitions from light to dark. The T goes to a nice, or from a nice mid to a very light tone in the up and cross stroke. The U, R stay light, and the E at the end quite a bit darker. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 7 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook. Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade just as well as it did with the Clairfontaine paper. Really very nice. Look at except on the first line, where the E is quite a bit lighter than the X. The CE are very light in tone, where the P becomes a mid-tone, and that T at the end quite a bit darker. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine. Same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade very well. No danger of it not doing that. Looking at danger on the second line, where the D is quite a bit darker than the AN and beginning of the G. It's during that G it gets quite a bit darker into the E and lightens up with the R at the end. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine. Same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread. It makes no secret about the shading that it's going to bring. Taking a look at secret on the first line, where most of the word is a lighter tone, but then it gets very dark with the T at the end. There's more shading that it can offer, although it does the same thing with more on the second line, where it starts light for the MOR, but the E at the end gets quite a bit darker. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it doesn't go without shading. It shades very well looking at without on the third line, where the width is a lighter tone. It's the cross of the T that it drags down through that T, darkening up a little bit. The H is also a bit darker. The OU lighten up a little bit, and a very dark T at the end. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook. Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a little bit darker, just a tad bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade, I think, a little better than it did on the Clairfontaine. The tone of the paper really brought out some of what this ink can do. Look at brought on the third line, where the BR are a darker midtone. The OU and beginning of the G are lightened up quite a bit. It's the downstroke of the G into the H that it returns to that darker midtone, and the T at the end quite a bit darker. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine. Same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade very well. I mean, it shades better here with this nib than I think it does in most of the writing samples. It really goes from much darker to much lighter shades, and it didn't even have to really struggle to do it. Take a look at handles on the third line, where the H is quite a bit darker than the AN and beginning of the D. Now, the D is a mid-tone. The LE get quite a bit darker, and that S at the end lighten up some. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine. Same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade like magic. Looking at magic on the third line, where the MA and the beginning of the G are lighter tones. It's the downstroke of that G that becomes much darker. The IC go to a slightly darker midtone, and that next to it starts lighter with the T, the H quite a bit darker, the A quite a bit lighter, the T quite a bit darker again. Really back and forth, light and dark shading, standing out amazingly here. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It is not terrified of doing any kind of shading. Look at terrified on the first line, where the beginning of the T is lighter. It's into the ERR. It becomes a nice midtone. Out of the I into the F, it lightens up some more. Back to a midtone for the IE and darker with the D at the end. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook. Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. However, here with this quad rule, I don't feel that it's a strong enough color to really stand out. The quad rule in the lighter areas of the writing are kind of eating it up. If you look at to call the on the second line, to call almost gets a little lost with some of those, where the, being a little bit darker, does stand out a little bit better. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade very well, better than it did on the Clairfontaine. I still don't feel very good about how this is standing out against the quad rule. I just think it needs to be darker than what it is for this tone to really be able to hold its own against this type of print on the paper. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. It's still not really standing out on that quad rule enough for me. I see both at the same time and it's a little visually confusing. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade very well, just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. It's just now starting to stand out against the quad rule, I think as a result of the broader nib, which means it's a really good point here where it didn't stand out 3 times, but this time I think it's starting to. So there's times those broader nibs can really work in your favor. Like here, I think it's starting to stand out and become its own thing away from the background. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Ackerman SBRE Brown. Here is Colorverse Dark Energy. Here is Diamine Rustic Brown. Here is KWZ Cappuccino. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook. Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade very well, just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. However, it is not standing out against this quad rule and it becomes a bit visually confusing. Not the best ink for a student to use here. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is the same tone as the soft fine, a whole lot lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade, it is not standing out on the quad rule, leaving me a little disappointed with it on this paper. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade, it does not stand out on the quad rule, and I don't want to, beat this dead horse, but it's not doing it. It's just not really working here. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade without any kind of a problem. It does not stand out against the quad rule. While it did it on the Clairfontaine, I was hoping that the broad would really help it here. It didn't. It didn't make it stand out on its own away from the quad rule, letting that sort of melt into the background. It's still there, still a bit visually confusing, so not a great ink for this paper. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Califolio Rose Granat. Here is Diamine Meadow.
Here is Private Reserve Orange Crush.
Here is Cross Blue Black.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. Kind of surprising with that. It does feather, I'm thinking, when you look at thinking on the first and second line. It occurs in both. It does have the tiniest bit of spread. Now the spread is nothing. The shading, or sorry, the feathering comes with when it shades. As it gets darker, it feathers more. It's a bit of a problem. Not a good ink for on this paper at all. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather a whole lot more than it did with the soft fine. It does spread a bit more than it did with the soft fine. It is a wetter pen after all. It does shade. It shades very well, but it's the feathering and the spread, especially the feather. I mean, I don't know that I can pick a word that does not have some feathering going on that draws my eye to it, making this very distracting to use on this paper and not a good match. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit lighter than it was with the wet fine, little lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather and it does spread. It does not feather as much as it did with the wet fine. It doesn't spread as much as it did with the wet fine. It puts it more into this category of serviceable on this paper. You could use it, and this is really the only of the non-fountain pen friendly papers that I was not happy with its performance on. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, lighter than it was just a little bit than the Clairfontaine. It does feather and it does spread. Some of the areas of feathering are a little more pronounced than they were with the medium. Really, I think considering what we've got, this is more serviceable than what we had with the wet fine. Still not something I would really go to. However, if you had a drier broad, this might work out pretty well. Looking at the page underneath, there was this one spot during the broad writing that it did dot the page underneath. So not horrible, probably wouldn't stop most people from using it. The back of the page, there's a fair amount of ghosting that goes on because you can see how deep the ink gets into the paper. I do not think you could write on the back of this page. So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The soft fine gives a beautiful lighter tone with some very good shading. The wet fine is the darkest tone and still shades very well, where the medium and the broad both look like the soft fine in tone and both show off shading much better than the soft fine did. Now, if a dark sepia is what you really like, then the only choice would be to go with a wet fine or wet medium nib. But I'm enjoying this classic look of this from just about every other pen. So I go for anything except a wet pen to preserve the beautiful tone of this ink. I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.